There we go. All great lecture series start with a gavel, right? I wish I had one. I'm Shawnthea Monroe. I am the senior pastor of the People's Church, and I am here to welcome you officially to the 2023 Henry and Annabelle Larzalier Memorial Lecture. We are so delighted and so excited to have Dr. Kristin DuMez speaking to us today. And I know that we're all going to learn a lot, some that's uncomfortable, and ultimately, I hope we learn a lot that is inspiring. Just a couple of things to say before I invite Dr. DuMez to the lectern. First of all, a thank you to the person whose phone went off. Would you all silence your phones now? That would be most helpful. I'm getting to the age where I don't quite hear it until everyone else has. So turn your phones to silent. And then also to let you know that the structure of our conversation today is that Dr. DuMez will speak for 45 minutes, and that will leave us ample time for questions and answers. That's always some of the most fruitful conversation that occurs. There's going to be a microphone that will go around, so if at the end you have a question, raise your hand. I will run to you and make sure that everybody hears the question as well as the answer. And then, of course, at the end of the event, out in Friendship Hall immediately to the back, Dr. DuMez will be signing her books. If you have brought one that you've already read your way through, she will sign those. But also there are 24 books that are for sale. If you have a check or cash, you pay Schuler Books, and then you can have a book to have it signed. I think that's the end of the details. As I said, it is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce our Henry and Annabelle Larzalier Memorial Lecturer today. It's Dr. Kristin DuMez, who is a New York Times best-selling author, as well as the professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University. Dr. DuMez holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the intersections of gender, religion, and politics. Fertile ground these days. She has written for many of the publications I know that we read, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Christianity Today, and she has been interviewed on many news outlets, NPR, CBS, and the BBC included. Her most recent book, and the one I think that has led us all to hear more from her, is Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. We look forward to hearing what she has to offer. Let us welcome Dr. DuMez.
Thank you all for coming, and I want to start with thanking the Larzalier family and for hosting this, and I've got to meet several members, and it's such a gift to all of us. So, as I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today, initially I thought I would kind of give my usual Jesus and John Wayne and the Evangelical Reckoning talk. I've got a number of variations of that talk, and they're all memorized now because I've been doing this for 3 years, and it's always fun. And then I thought, I'm not sure that that's what you need to hear in this moment. This moment feels like we're kind of turning a page, at least to me. With the election a year away, 2024, with concerns about the resiliency of our democracy rising. And I spend a lot of my time in Zoom meetings and in in-person collaborations with people working in pro-democracy coalitions. And if you were here this morning, you've heard that I have a background in 20th century Germany and actually genocide studies. And I thought that was a totally separate thing. That was kind of my side, break from US religious history. And I've kind of watched with horror as those fields have moved a little bit closer together in terms of authoritarian tendencies that we are seeing, particularly within white Christian spaces and especially within white evangelical spaces. So if I haven't already said something that is so offensive that you're going to leave, you can just settle in now. So I have a different talk for you, which is really grappling with this moment and thinking aloud with you in the Q&A about if I'm even partly right about what is happening right now, what should we all be doing in these next 12 months and beyond, okay? So that's the reckoning part here. But to understand what we should be doing, we have to understand the dynamics that we're looking at. And so I'm going to do my best to let you know what I'm seeing in the spaces that I've been watching very closely, and then we can open that up. So first, a few statistics. As you all know, in 2016, around 8 in 10 white evangelical voters chose Trump, support that proved critical to his victory. And 4 years later, that number held steady, remarkably steady. And while my focus is, as a historian, has been on white evangelicalism, this is not just a white evangelical thing. If you look at all the statistics that I'm going to be kind of throwing out here, the white mainline is not far behind, right? And then you can look at white Catholicism as well. So while my research is focusing on white evangelicalism, there are some broader applications here and some parallels. But let me give you a few more statistics from my little area. Despite Trump's defeat, 60% of white evangelicals believe that the 2020 election was stolen. 31%, almost a third of white evangelicals believe that, and here's the exact words of the survey question, true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save the country. We also know that white evangelicals have a penchant for nationalism, nativism, and authoritarian populism, a preference for rejecting political compromise, for strong solitary leadership, and for breaking the rules when necessary. And this is all straight out of surveys. And if you look at the introduction to my book, the longest footnote in that whole introduction is all of the surveys backing up these claims. Yet, as anyone who spends any time in evangelical spaces can attest, white evangelicals are divided amongst themselves. Maybe you are in those spaces yourselves. So on the one hand, you've got people like Sean Feucht and Greg Locke and Franklin Graham and others who are always grabbing the headlines for their vocal support for Trump or for peddling in conspiracy theories, for opposing public health mandates, and so on. Inside the Southern Baptist Convention, you've got folks like Al Mohler, the never-Trumper, who's now a staunch Trump supporter, and you've got a conservative faction there. But on the other hand, you also have prominent white evangelicals like David French, Russell Moore, and Beth Moore, to name just a few, who have tried to push back against the evangelical capitulation to Trump and the whole-scale alignment with reactionary politics, some at the cost of employment. Now, the majority of white evangelicals are actually found somewhere between these positions. And understanding the range of views within evangelicalism is important. But so is understanding the power dynamics operative inside evangelical organizations and institutions. For those concerned with the resiliency of American democracy, I don't think it is inaccurate to suggest that the fate of democracy may well come down to how these moderate evangelicals respond to the escalating erosion of democratic norms and institutions. And deciphering which way evangelical moderates will fall is no easy task. To begin with, Many evangelicals and their defenders insist on downplaying the centrality of politics. Evangelicalism, they say, is not political. It is a movement defined by its theology. Evangelicals themselves, you'll hear, are salt of the earth Christians who give generously to charitable causes. They care for their local communities. Too often, they've been demonized, their words, by scholars and the media. And as such, they should not be unfairly stereotyped, lumped together in the basket of deplorables with the neo-Nazi marchers in Charlottesville and other supremacists. Again, I'm quoting from some of these direct allegations here. And it is true that most white evangelicals were not marching with neo-Nazis in Charlottesville, nor were most evangelicals storming the Capitol on January 6th. Yet, it is also true that underlying affinities make it difficult for many mainstream evangelicals to unequivocally condemn these acts. Now remember those opening statistics. In fact, in many cases, the kind of kinder, gentler version of evangelicalism has proven to be fully compatible with the movement's authoritarian tendencies. Let me give you an example. So my next book is called Live, Laugh, Love. And it is a cultural history of white Christian womanhood. And so stay tuned for that one. But if you're wondering what on earth does that have to do with Jesus and John Wayne, a couple years back, I went to a Trump rally. I go to Trump rallies on occasion, whenever I can, actually. And this one was actually the speaker, Trump wasn't there. The speaker was Karen Pence. And as I walked into the space, which was held in a kind of wedding venue type location, party tent, and there were candles, scented candles out, and there was praise music playing, and it was, flowers, and all very live, laugh, love, if you know what I'm talking about. And then she got up in ways that would resonate with almost any Christian woman I know, made a strong case for Trump and everything he stands for. And I got to thinking of how this mirrors in some ways the evangelical gender roles that I had written about, that champion a rugged patriarchal leadership that is necessary to guide and protect the gentle, vulnerable women, the softer version of the faith. It needs the protection of a harsher and more aggressive strand. The two go hand in hand. And insisting that the gentler version is the true evangelicalism, which many evangelical defenders will do, obscures this dynamic. And in doing so, it gives cover to the more dangerous elements. And one of the central themes that I explore in Jesus and John Wayne is the connection between evangelicalism's more extreme expressions and its more respectable representatives. So if you've read the book, you'll see in one chapter, I hold up Bill Gothard, extreme, right? We can all agree. If you've seen shiny, happy people there, like this is extreme. But I put him side by side with James Dobson, right? As mainstream as you can get in conservative evangelicalism, they are not one and the same, but when they talk about authority, when they talk about hierarchy, when they talk about patriarchy, there is a lot of overlap, and it is easy to go from one to the other. In the book, I also saw how respected leaders like John Piper and organizations like Christianity Today platformed unapologetic racists like Doug Wilson, and how the abusive and misogynistic behavior of pastors like Mark Driscoll was excused or tacitly condoned by the same, if not openly celebrated. Misogynists, abusers, and racists were all defended as, and I quote, brothers in Christ, as allies in a larger cause. Yet evangelicals have rarely hesitated to draw stark boundaries around orthodoxy to the left. When evangelicals like Jen Hatmaker or Rachel Held Evans moved to the left on issues like sexuality and gender, they quickly found themselves excluded from the evangelical fold by the gatekeepers. And the boundaries of evangelicalism are policed by prominent organizations like the Southern Baptist Convention, very powerful, the Gospel Coalition also, but the boundaries of evangelicalism are also policed by the evangelical marketplace. So evangelicals like to claim that they are defined by their theology. In Jesus and John Wayne, I suggest that they may be better defined as a consumer culture, business. Over the past half century or more, evangelicals have produced and consumed a vast quantity of products. Christian books, Christian magazines, Christian music, TV, radio, films, ministry conferences. Ministry conferences, if you know, you know, right? Home decor, live, laugh, love. So much. And to those outside of this world, they don't even know it exists. So when I was writing Jesus and John Wayne, my editor was going through, he flagged a few of my claims where I was putting in sales figures for evangelical bestsellers. 10 million, 20 million, 65 million. And he just said, yeah, there's no way, Kristin. You need to know, in the world of publishing, we like to inflate our numbers maybe, and you just, where did you get these numbers? And I was like, oh, let me see. Oh, that's from the New York Times. And he said, oh, never mind. Then it's accurate. No sense for this huge volume of material that was shaping a huge swath of American citizens. And these aren't books that they were just casually reading. These are books that they were buying and reading in their small groups in churches as God's word to them for their lives and for the lives of others. When you think in terms of a market, you also then know that if you alienate a loyal conservative base, it can have devastating financial consequences. Again, much more in the next book on this, but in a recent interview I conducted with somebody who works for a major evangelical organization, what they told me was revealing. They talked about internal messaging that employees got, that they did not have to agree with Trump and MAGA politics. Totally fine if they didn't, they just couldn't speak out against it. And that is exactly the dynamic at play. Within institutions and organizations, too, conservative donors and constituents often hold definitive power. So nonprofits like Bethany Christian Services and World Vision faced swift backlash after shifting to more progressive stances on LGBTQ rights. The latter quickly recanted. Major Christian news organizations, such as the Christian Post and World Magazine, have pushed out established journalists who refuse to toe the pro-Trump party line. Similar stories abound at the level of the local church, and my guess is some of you here today have stories to tell. As one evangelical pastor told Pete Weiner not long ago, nearly everyone tells me there is at the very least a small group in nearly every evangelical church complaining and agitating against the teaching or policies that aren't sufficiently conservative or anti-woke. Now, the fact that this prominent figure in the evangelical world who was talking to Weiner felt the need to speak anonymously reveals the nature of these power dynamics. A year ago, I was invited to speak to a very large group of evangelical pastors. I never take those invitations for granted. I always show up. And I started that talk off by affirming just how hard it was to be an evangelical pastor. It is incredibly hard. And many pastors are at a loss because they have thought of themselves as leaders. But what they've discovered over the past few years is the cruel awakening that they exert very little leadership over their flocks. 2016 was a humbling time for a lot of pastors. In fact, it was actually already apparent in 2015, at the earliest stages during the primary season, when we were already seeing that grassroots support for Trump starting to surface in the evangelical community. And Washington Post covered it in August 2015. But Russell Moore, then kind of most powerful position in the SBC, the head of ERLC, said, nah, he was not buying it, and he called out the media on it. He said this is just the reality TV phase of the campaign, and that he had not talked to a single pastor. Again, most powerful guy in the SBC had not talked to a single pastor who was pro-Trump. Leaders like Moore came to see that their endorsements meant little. The evangelical activist Randy Brinson later described, "It is the most amazing thing I have ever seen. It is like the total reversal of the shepherd and the flock." And of course, Moore was out of his job within a couple years. And this reality has been difficult to accept, perhaps especially for a generation of pastors who had attended wildly popular conferences on leadership and consumed countless resources affirming their divine call to lead. And maybe those books and conferences on leadership were part of the problem. Maybe also all this church growth stuff. Too often, what was packaged and sold as spiritual formation was really just part of an industry, a billion-dollar industry, where conferences, books, resources, platforms, donations, even tithes are all a source of revenue. Evangelicalism is more than this, but it is not less than this. And I told pastors that if they find these times challenging, it may be helpful to keep in mind that they are up against this industry. And they often blame the secular media, Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, Tucker Carlson for discipling their flock. And they are absolutely right. But it isn't just out there, it is inside. Popular Christian culture, Christian radio, Christian publishing, and organizations that platform preachers and sell products. That is what they are up against. And they aren't just up against the industry, they are part of this industry. Always, always follow the money. Who is making money? What is required for access into places where the money is made? What price do people pay who interfere with the people making the money? A lot of things are marketed and sold, and a lot of money changes hands under the guise of ministry. And pastors aren't just up against an invisible hand of the market. If you push back against the status quo, which in white evangelicalism means conservative politics and alignment with the current Republican Party, and there's a long history there, you are going up against an extremely well-funded and well-organized political network. And good-hearted evangelical pastors may think that the answer to our toughest questions are to be found in opening the scriptures and reading theology, seeking truth in community and in light of tradition. But that is not how this game is being played, at least by some of the players. And maybe also not by the scorekeepers and the refs, and it hasn't been for a very long time. While many are operating with sincerity and in good faith, the playing field has been circumscribed. The rules established to benefit some at the cost of others, and their interest is not fair play or genuine faith-based inquiry, to the great detriment of the church. Now, decades ago, I write about this in Jesus and John Wayne, Christian college presidents knew to fear James Dobson. Cross any number of lines, and he will make sure your donors will dare to discipline you. Organizations that adopt a more progressive position on LGBTQ, again, face brutal backlash. And this is not just an organic grassroots response. There is an organizational scaffolding that goes back decades to coordinate these responses and they follow a common playbook. And you can go through the history of the Christian right, organizations and networks like the Council for National Policy, ADF, prominent pastors, influencers, donors, policymakers. The web is expansive, and it is still out there. Can include the conservative forces in the SBC, like Founders and CBN, Fox News, Shapiro's Daily Wire, Liberty University, Standing for Freedom Center, the Heritage Foundation, throw in Claremont if you want, Wilson's Little Moscow Empire, the whole homeschool network, Hillsdale, right? Many of these have direct links to Trump's inner circle. Now, not long ago, I watched a conference online sponsored by NatCon and the Family Research Council, with Roots and Dobson's focus on the family. And there they told their audience, go back to your churches and pressure your pastors. Right? Force them to fall in line, and if they don't, pull your support, and that is your job. And last year, too, I got a glimpse at how this plays out. We all did, those of us on Twitter, when one conservative evangelical influencer, Kosti Hin, felt compelled to call out another, Doug Wilson, despite sharing common cause in the culture wars. This is very unusual. And because it played out on social media, it offered this fascinating glimpse at the risks entailed in these circles by disagreeing with powerful men. And what happens when one refuses to ally with men regardless of character to pursue these larger aims, either theological or political. So what happened is on his podcast, Hin explained why he felt compelled to call out his brother, Wilson. He said, if we claim gospel fidelity, if we claim that we are men of character, and we point out and refute those who are not, then how dare we embrace those who do not hold that truth in the way that they carry themselves? So this kind of behavior, calling out his brother's behavior. He went on and said, I am done playing the celebrity Christian game, though, where we overlook sin and unholy alliances for money, mutual back-scratching, and the anti-woke movement. So I would point you to this episode in its entirety online, but it's not available. Hin was pressured to remove it and make nice with Wilson, who then posted a video joking about doxing him, all in good fun. This was a rare close-up at how power operates in these spaces. Usually all of this happens behind closed doors. Now, in this game, the key targets are moderate Christians, Orthodox Christians who lean progressive on even just one issue, or even conservative Christians who resist the reactionary extremes. Beth Moore, Russell Moore, David French, these are not liberals, right? Phil Vischer, and yes, on occasion, myself. And there are a whole lot of people far less well known than that list who face the onslaught without the support someone like me has, or who don't have the luxury of well-placed friends and book deals to cushion the blow if and when they lose their jobs. When I spoke to that lecture hall filled with evangelical pastors, I told them, if you are feeling like you are up against a lot right now, you are. And also I said, you did this to yourselves. And then I explained how, over the past half-century, white evangelicals had shaped their movement through exclusion and coercion, such that by 2016, the voices they needed to listen to were nowhere to be found. And first, we have to talk about race. Now, my book's subtitle is admittedly a little provocative, but I didn't realize exactly how provocative it was. Turns out that little adjective white is triggering for some. I've been accused more than once of being racist for including white in the subtitle. And I didn't mean it to be pejorative, just descriptive. Just wanted to be precise. And this points us to a foundational question. What is evangelicalism and who are evangelicals? if we insist on a theological definition, which is what evangelical leaders love to do, it can be really difficult to see what whiteness has to do with anything. It's just a little checklist of theological beliefs, right? But if we think of evangelicalism as a historical and cultural movement, whiteness is everywhere visible, if you know where to look. Did you know that when the Fundamentals were first published in 1910, the series of writings that define orthodoxy and from which fundamentalists get their name, right? They were sent out free to white pastors across the country, but not to a single black pastor, many of whom shared all of those doctrinal commitments. Did you know when the National Association of Evangelicals was formed, black denominations were excluded from association? When racial justice surfaced in its early years in conversations among the founders of Christianity today, it was deemed too divisive to engage directly. Those with openly racist and segregationist views were kept in the fold, while black pastors were kept at arm's length. Historian Jesse Curtis has shown us how the myth of colorblind Christians, that's the title of his book, came to dominate white evangelical understandings of race and foster in them a benevolent understanding of themselves, a belief in their own righteousness and innocence. People of color who bolstered this myth of innocence were welcomed and platformed. Anyone who challenged it was ushered out the door. Now, I have nothing against CRT, but what I'm talking about here is not CRT. It is basic U.S. history, and it is the history of U.S. evangelicalism. So when Jesus and John Wayne published, I started getting letters. I was fortunate enough to have the book really launched because it was on Morning Edition with Steve Inskeep the day it released. So it was out there in the world in a pretty loud way. And within about 3 days, I started getting letters in my inbox. They still come every single day. I got one this morning. And you'd think I get a lot of hate mail. I get almost none. Almost none. Instead, over and over and over again, I get some version of, "This is the story of my life, and thank you for helping me to see." So many shocked at what they read in the book, and also deeply familiar somehow at the same time. And I had to wrestle with this. How can it be so shocking and so familiar? I literally had people send me pictures of their bookshelves that had all the books that I talk about, right? This is the story of their lives. But evangelicals have had a way of controlling their own narrative. Right? I talked about this industry. I talked about these massive numbers, and evangelicals love to tell stories about themselves. And then any other history that comes in that says, well, let me tell you about the history of the NAE. Let me tell you how race actually functioned here. That comes across as smearing, as hateful, as false, right? And instead, that is just history. The story of American evangelicalism is the story of exclusion. Generation after generation. Isaac Sharp has a new book out on this called The Other Evangelicals. And I know that there are some ex-evangelicals in this group here and others who have kind of moved in these spaces. If you're trying to understand evangelicalism and maybe how you feel or why you feel alienated, this is a great book, The Other Evangelicals. And it shows how those in evangelical communities who cling to the identity and to the scriptures over and over again found themselves pushed out and defined out of the fold. We've noted that marginalization and erasure with respect to black evangelicals, we also see it around the issue of gender. There's a very long history of evangelical feminism, going back more than a century before Betty Friedan discovered that problem that has no name. And I know because I wrote a book on it. My first book is on the history of evangelical feminism. Christian women, evangelical women, white evangelical women were among the leading proponents of women's suffrage and women's rights more broadly in the 19th century. They pointed out the dangers of the sexual double standard, as they called it, an overemphasis on female purity, which they called out as unbiblical. And they offered sophisticated theological critiques of patriarchy. They were thoroughly evangelical, yet they have been forgotten, or rather, they have been disappeared. There's agency here. Just as an example, I was reading a book a couple of years ago on who is evangelical, and it makes the case actually for including Black evangelicals in the history of evangelicalism, going all the way back to Phyllis Wheatley, and lamenting the ways that Black evangelicals have been marginalized and excluded. So far, so good. But when it came to feminists, no mention of this whole history. And then Frances Willard made an appearance. Frances Willard, leader of the biggest women's organization and pro-suffrage organization of the 19th century, an evangelical Methodist. Not one mention was made of her views on women. She was called out positively for her stance against the Armenian genocide, which she did do, among many, many other things. But not one mention was made of her life's mission, protecting and expanding the rights of women. The result of this erasure means that patriarchy remains normative, biblical, traditional, instead of contested, as it was historically and theologically. And you see how this works? If you erase that history, it is much easier to erase feminist evangelicals today. They cannot be true evangelicals, and since evangelical, in many of these spaces, equals true Christian, you see where this goes. We could talk about inerrancy. Inerrancy, too, has a history, and a relatively short history. And it is a method that has always been unequally applied by evangelicals, used as a gatekeeping strategy to enforce particular views of gender and sexuality. But when it comes to certain other passages, turn the other cheek, love your neighbor, sell your possessions, because it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than a camel through an eye of the needle. You've heard those things, right? They don't get the inerrancy treatment. The history of American evangelicalism is one of gatekeeping, and that is the story that I tell in Jesus in John Wayne. Yes, there are and have always been progressive evangelicals, the moral minority, if you will, and conservative evangelicals. But there has always also been asymmetry here. What are the power dynamics inside evangelical organizations and inside denominations? Who is considered inside the fold and who is cast outside the gates? Which shortcomings are quickly forgiven and excused? Blatant racism, misogyny, abuse of power, sexual abuse, or covering up sexual abuse? Well, at least he gets the gospel right. At least he gets the gospel right. Now, I have only ever heard that sentence in these spaces with the masculine pronoun. Nobody in these spaces said that about Beth Moore. Talk about somebody who gets the gospel right. I have never once heard of any of my conservative evangelical detractors, and I do have a few, apply that to me. I have never once seen a conservative evangelical apply that to an LGBTQ Christian struggling to live faithfully, but one who has drawn different conclusions, often after years of careful study of the scriptures. When I talk to conservative evangelical leaders, I ask them, who is included in your gospel coalition? Who was never welcome? Who was actively purged? And on what terms? On the basis of the gospel or something else? What are the primary issues and what are the secondary issues? Not in terms of what one pays lip service to, but in terms of what one actually does. And if you are not sure, historians can lend a hand. One of the unfortunate side effects of my researching and writing Jesus and John Wayne is that the phrase brother in Christ has lost its luster for me. I saw too many times the harm done by misplaced deference. Misplaced deference. In evangelical circles, there is so much deference shown to people with power, to men with power. And it comes across as humility on the part of one showing deference, as righteous, as noble, but it often masks one's own grasp for power, because there are rules that you have to follow inside these spaces to get that book contract, that blogging slot, to get invited on the main platform. So where does this leave us now? Evangelicals like to talk about leadership, and evangelicals do need leaders, courageous leaders, leaders who will break these chains of influence and deference. But doing so will come at a cost because of this history, because of this industry. And I see the costs that so many people are paying inside these evangelical spaces. And I do not take these costs lightly. But it is too few and too little, and probably also too late. In their book, How Democracies Die, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt describe the essential role that political parties play as stewards of democracy. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it, How Democracies Die. By acting as gatekeepers, political parties weed out authoritarian candidates before they pose a real threat to democracy. So if you look at Western history, there are a lot of wannabe dictators that pop up here and there, right? And almost all of those are weeded out by strong and principled political parties. But timing here is critical. As establishment politicians in places like Germany, Italy, and Venezuela discovered too late, there is a window of time when it is possible to rein in potential demagogues. And I think the same logic might apply to the white evangelical world. For too long, evangelical gatekeepers failed to denounce and expunge extremists. Too many evangelical leaders turned a blind eye to the white supremacy, nationalism, and abusive cultures in their own midst, in the interest of culture wars coalition building, even as they were very quick to exclude and purge those who might have helped them do so. Now these very establishment evangelicals are the ones being removed from positions of power. Or, like Al Mohler, they learn to stay quiet or switch sides. He's not quiet, switch sides. It's too little, or it's too late, and it's also too little. How many of those, even those who have taken courageous stands, have genuinely reckoned with their own complicity in bringing us where we are now? And I will say, of the high-profile evangelical dissenters, I am aware of one who has publicly and painfully interrogated their own complicity, and that is Beth Moore. And this is why it's hard to be optimistic. So often I'm asked to end on a hopeful note. But the truth is, when I look at this history, and then when I look at the current landscape, when I take account of these power dynamics, when I see so little courage and so much pursuit of comfort and protection of power, I am not optimistic for change. There is no quick fix here. When evangelical leaders ask me what can be done, I tell them, and with great appreciation for any who are willing to ask this question, that until they have a clearer understanding of how they got here, they are not going to be able to make a dent in it. And by relentlessly excluding some and tolerating and platforming others, excluding voices who could have moderated and challenged, excluding and embracing others, but only, or excusing and embracing others, but only in one direction, this has brought us where we are. And until they understand that history and what they will face if they try to change course, there's not much hope for change. Until they reckon with this, any efforts to rebuild will probably just produce more of the same. So, how about the rest of us? What can the rest of us do? I will tell you, this question keeps me up at night. As a historian, I specialize in diagnosis. But I worry that in this case, the diagnosis may work against the cure. So, if you look at scholars of authoritarianism and rising authoritarianism, proto-fascism, whatever word you would like to use, of the death of democracy, one theme that comes over and over again is the disappearance of the center right. That is one thing that happens consistently in an authoritarian takeover. Now, if I look at our country and apply that framework, who is the center right? That's a whole lot of moderate white evangelicals and moderate white Christians, okay? I do think that our democracy is teetering on the brink, and I say that as somebody who's spent the last couple of years in collaborative work and pro-democracy coalitions, and with scholars and activists, including Republicans or former Republicans who are deeply concerned with what they see. It's usually the Republicans who are the most concerned. As Christians, we need to call out the idolatry of Christian nationalism. But we also need to find a way to give patriotic, conservative Christians an off-ramp. It plays into the hands of Christian nationalists to make this you're a Christian nationalist or you're a progressive liberal. And that is exactly what they do every single day. If you dissent on one point of their political agenda, you are anti-Christian, you are anti-Christ. And we cannot play into their hands because we know it is not true. We have to distinguish between views we disagree with and those intent on actively undermining our democracy. In a democracy, there are going to be friends, neighbors, family members, church members who hold views that you think are terrible, right? The nature of democracy is we have to still work together, and then we fight it out through our elections and through our rational discourse, ideally. We need to mobilize, we do. We really need to vote in this next election, and we need to bring out voters, and this is not a partisan call by any means. I think, frankly, all of us need to be thinking in this next electoral season of voting for democracy and figuring out what that looks like so that we can live another day to fight our battles, right, and to have our disagreements. We need to be clear-eyed about the challenges that we are facing, but we also have to be strategic. What we need now is not more call-out culture, more alienation, certainly not condescension and mockery. What we need is something more mundane. We need tolerance and respect and resilience. We need truth and grace. We need to stand firm. We need to speak the truth, even when it makes us uncomfortable. But we also need to build bridges. We need to maintain those relationships, hold on to the people a little to our left and a little to our right. We need to invite others into our spaces and into our coalitions with open arms. And I do not know exactly how we do this, and I live in this tension every day. And I don't know that even if we do, if it will be enough, but I can't think of another path forward. And I will leave you with that, so maybe you will have some sleepless nights now. But also, I would love to talk further with you in the Q&A.
Wonderful words, disturbing somewhat, but now a chance for us to engage with the ideas put forward and ask some questions. Raise your hands.
think I'm slightly more positive than you. Going back 50 years, taking history courses on the Revolution, American Revolution, there was sort of a trope about in any kind of situation like this, you're going to have 1/3 of the people who want the revolution, 1/3 of the people who don't. They want to stay where they are. And then you got to convince the people in the middle.
Yeah.
As a Catholic, I understand sort of these conservative, liberal kind of definitions in my past, and that seems pretty dark, your description of the evangelical movement, because they've basically been removing any sense of a middle. So at that point, you end up with the conservatives, the extreme conservatives, the really, really, really extreme conservatives, and it's gone. But I look at the larger society, and I think one of the issues, and I'd like you maybe to speak to this, is that it's difficult being a Christian in a country in which personal freedom and liberty is at the core. And the whole abortion issue seems to me, as much as I may be personally against abortion, I still feel like I'm an American. I have to give people freedom to make their own choices. And it seems that one of the issues with this that you're terrifyingly describing for us is that these people are taking away these freedoms. And
Yeah.
so in appealing to the larger population, when I taught government, I would always say to my kids, you can put a monkey on that ticket for a Democrat and 33% of the people will vote for that monkey. You could put a monkey on the Republican ticket and 33% will vote for that monkey. We're kind of in that position. The issue is, what do we do with the other 33%?
Right, so there's a lot there. I won't be able to touch on everything, but I mean, you're right that right now a fundamental tension is for many American Christians, how do we reconcile Christianity and what we think is good and true and what we want for our country with the freedoms guaranteed in the Constitution? And as you articulated that, you see that there could sometimes be a tension. In Christian nationalist spaces, and this is a term that you hear a lot now, we don't have to use that one, but proponents of a Christian America, what makes this so tricky is that many are using the same language to mean very different things. So some mean, yes, this would be Christian America, sure. And yes, I want it to reflect Christian values, and they mean it in a pretty generic way. Loving your neighbors yourself is a Christian value, right? Good, true, beautiful things. And others mean it in a very different, much more precise and rigid way, which is the idea that by America being founded as a Christian nation is built on a myth of origins that essentially define the founder's vision as something that aligns 100% with current conservative white evangelicals. And reading that back, some will even say the founding documents were inspired by God. Now, here's how this logic goes. If inspired by God, it was inspired to form a nation built on biblical principles. So if the Constitution was inspired by God to establish a distinctively Christian nation, and they changed like Thomas Jefferson's words to make this work, really, then the rights that it protects and defends, right, ensures, could not possibly run up against God's laws, right? You see how this goes. So gay rights, impossible, right? Those can't be written into the Constitution. This is how that logic goes in more extreme cases. So the really tricky thing for me as somebody in the media who's trying to explain this and define this is to describe, okay, what does this person mean by this? Well, what can we tell about who he's quoting, who he's hanging out with, track record, how it has applied in his previous legislation, versus somebody in the pew who may say very similar sounding things. But then when you're on MSNBC calling this out and raising the alarm, this is actually what this guy means, the person in the pew is like, how dare you, right? How dare you call me whatever Christian nationalist or authoritarian leaning or all of that, right? That is what is so tricky. So that's the strategy I'm talking about. It is very hard because we don't get to define the terms and we rarely get to set the narrative. And we're stuck in this situation. It is really messy. So on an individual level, one thing that works, very well is just making it hard for people on the other side of whichever, however you define your sides, to make it hard for them to dismiss you. And this is where human relationships are so important because there are so many stereotypes and myths that kind of circulate in demonization inside these spaces. And the only thing that really works against that, it's not yelling, it's not disagreeing, it's not backing them into a corner rhetorically, it's living next to them. And they're like, wait, that doesn't apply, that's not accurate, right? But it's easy to live in our echo chambers and it's enticing to do that.
First, thank you so much for writing the book.
Thank you.
I read it quite a while ago from the library. I am Jewish on my parents' side, and I love the Jewish boy. Because I was born during the Holocaust, my mother was very sober in raising me. Her prophecy was, the world is run by the filthy rich, money is power, and all decisions are driven by greed. My question is, how much money do the white evangelicals have? And how does that compare to other groups and how much money they have?
Yeah.
Because money is power. Thank you.
Yes. They have a whole lot. And I don't have, it's impossible, or maybe it's possible. I haven't done the math. Math isn't my strong suit, but I rely on other figures. And then what is evangelicalism, right? This is where, we could look at denominations, massive budgets of a organization like the Southern Baptist Convention, which is now trying to protect its assets in light of sex abuse lawsuits. And so you've got that, but then you've got, like I said, this whole marketplace, and that's where there is just so much money, and it's billions that we're talking about here. And even I'm trying to get somebody to write a book on the Christian conference circuit. If you know how that works, right? You know what I'm talking about here. So much money, and that is also where books are sold and all the revenue that changes hands. Now the thing is, evangelicals aren't unique. Like you said, your mom said, right? This is how the world works, and who has money, who has power. But evangelicals are somewhat exceptional in that they are better than most at denying that reality, even as they practice it. Everything is ministry. It's evangelism. It's doing God's work, and their prayers reinforce this, their culture reinforces it. And so when you come and say, let's actually look at those books, right? Let's actually think about this. Let's think about how power operates. Let's think about how this constrains you. If you want to write a book, if you want to be a popular speaker, if you want to get a book deal, if you want to get speaking invitations, that sort of thing, there are rules that you have to follow. If you want to be a pastor of a large church, there are rules that you need to follow in these spaces. So the genuine truth-telling comes at an extremely high cost. And it's not just a cost of dollars, it's a cost of community. And I know so many pastors who are acting against their consciences, who are self-censoring, but justify it not so that they bring home the paycheck, although that is, they're supporting a family, but they don't want to lose their connection to their people. And that's real, right? That is real, but we also have to name that. We have to name the money changing hands when we see it change hands. And then also I would say, there's so many elements. There's the popular culture, and then there's the formal political fundraising, donation, funding class. And I mentioned the Council for National Policy as just one example. I could name names, including those that have built buildings at my own university. The money that is being poured into these right-wing spaces, there is no equivalent on the left, certainly not on the Christian left, right? Because all these people on the Christian left, they're people like Shane Claiborne, who, will live out of a van and be happy. And he is a lovely person, and he did. It was a bus. Right? And so you don't have, if you're in business on the other hand, and you benefit, and your business benefits from getting rid of government regulations and taxes and so on, you have a whole lot to work with, and it's a direct investment in your own profit making to fund these political organizations. There is nothing like it on the left. And that is what we are up against. And I don't have a solution, but at least know what we're up against.
Okay, thank you. There's so many things I could say or ask. But what I'm really interested in, I did my undergrad at Taylor University, which my dad still insists turned me liberal, and because of how conservative I grew up, he was right.
I get you.
And so I double majored in English and creative writing and history, and I've gone the route of teaching writing. And what I'm really interested in this whole discussion, what role do things like Shiny Happy People, Shannon Harris's memoir, Kate West, my good friend, has her memoir coming out. What role do those individual stories maybe play in not toppling this empire, because I don't think that's possible, but giving space, giving voice, encouraging conversation, letting those other stories be heard. So any thoughts on that? I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, so Shiny Happy People, that's the Amazon limited series on the Duggars and Gothard, and I was in that along with Alex Harris to bring the kind of, and this is why it matters nationally, this isn't just this little Gothard Duggar sect, it is that, but much broader repercussions. I think that those personal narratives are hugely important on a personal level to reach others in those spaces. So Kate's forthcoming book, this is Kate West, she's gonna have a memoir out of being a stay-at-home daughter whose family was influenced by the Doug Wilson sorts. Shannon Harris, her new memoir, there are many that are out and coming out. Hugely important for people to know that they are not alone, and that what happened to them was weird, and also very common, right? And that's hugely healing, I think, for many people who are struggling to figure out how to move on with their own lives wherever they find themselves. And I do think it is chipping away at the base. What it is doing is a book, a podcast, things like this can get inside some of those spaces, not the most secluded homeschool ones. Those are pretty locked down, but everywhere else. And that didn't used to be the case even 20 years ago. And so now, I think especially of the women and the girls in these spaces, they will have access to other voices if they're seeking them out. And I think that is hugely important. And I know that many of these gatekeepers are angry and are doing everything they can to discredit and demonize the people who are speaking out. And I know I feel that myself, and I get it. For me, it's not personal, and I don't take it personally because I know this. I know they're acting exactly as they ought to act if what I said is correct. And so it's not personal when they come after me. But I also don't think, and I think that Jesus and John Wayne I know it's been very important in some of these spaces. It's been important to explain and then also mobilize, and they detest it and me. But I also I don't fool myself. I know those sales figures of their books. Jesus and John Wayne does not even come close, right? Again, so keep things in perspective. These books, these works, these voices, absolutely important, and we need more of them. And we are up against something so much bigger. So we can testify.
Thank you.
Hi. As a young person, I think Your conversation is really interesting. I don't know if you can touch on anything relating to evangelicalism within like college campuses or like over the internet. I know I've met some people on my campus who are very radicalized, and it's just very interesting to see as a young person because you also meet other people who are very progressive and very liberal.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you can touch on that at all.
Yeah, so survey data, to big picture first, it suggests that, and this is something kind of relatively new, that white evangelicals are losing numbers. Before it was always the main line was dwindling, and now white evangelicalism is feeling some of that too, and particularly with young people, but be careful I wouldn't overstate the significance yet. And it's happening across the board in terms of organized religion, not just with conservative evangelicals. So when I hear progressives gleefully say, aha, it's the politics, right? You're losing the young people, we told you so. That is true for some young people who can't stomach the politics, but I just don't think we can make too much of that yet in terms of broader trends. What I see among young people, I guess the sign of, and yes, you've got the radicalization, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, you've got these spaces out there. Also, organizations like Turning Point USA really working to radicalize politically and mobilize, and that is picking up steam. So that's something I have my eye on. But I also see a kind of countervailing trend, which is that, so I'm older, my childhood was in the 90s, in these spaces, like late 80s, 90s, when it was, I think, more possible to be more fully immersed in evangelicalism, in that popular culture. Now, because of social media and because of digital access to everything, it is much harder to be that isolated. And there are many of my generation, and they bond now over the fact that they just completely missed out on popular culture for about 2 or 3 decades, right? And so it was and that is how that communal and cultural and political identity was forged. And I don't think that holds as strongly and as widely now. So those are the things I look at, and then every survey that comes out, I just try to keep up on. One final thought. I will say that the moderate to progressive leaning, kind of moderate, open-minded, generous young people, whom are actually the majority that I run into, do not seem to be very politically active, and that concerns me deeply. I mean, I'm in my 40s. I'm getting too old for this. It's supposed to be the young people who are like leading the charge here, save democracy. And so it really worries me that the people we most need just don't seem all that interested.
Let me preface what I'm going to say by saying I think a great deal of Calvin University. My wife went to Calvin. I go to the Christian Reformed Church. Most of the people there went to Calvin. My grandson went to Calvin. How are you received at Calvin?
I should check. This is being recorded, right? I think it is, yeah.
Very well.
I'm basically, yeah, super well. No, actually, remarkably well. I was just having a conversation with our president a couple days ago in light of some things that were being said about me by some websites and some calls that were coming in from certain pastors about whether or not I think Christ is supreme. You can Google it. So he came up to me and said, come here. And I was like, okay. And his question to me was, what do you need? What can we do for you? Name it. And I will say, I almost lost it talking. My husband was there too, like from across the room. This was at a party, right? And my husband saw me from it, and he came up. He's like, "Are you okay? What was that about? Like, did you just get fired?" Always a possibility. And I was like, no. I was like emotional because I was just blown away by that level of support. And I cannot speak more highly of my president and my university for backing me, because I know how this game is played. And I travel all over to Christian universities, Christian colleges around the country, and I get emails. I mean, very early on, even before this book came out, when I started to kind of put a few things out there, blog posts, I got an email from another Christian college faculty member somewhere else in the country and just said, "Are you going rogue? How are you doing this?" And kudos to Calvin, strong tradition of academic freedom, and within Reformed Christianity, a commitment to social justice. It's not the only thing in that tradition, but it is there. And a very strong commitment to disciplinary expertise. And so far, so good. And so I'm just absolutely thrilled that I can do what I do at Calvin, and I love doing what I do as a representative of Calvin. And I also know that folks who do not like what I do, especially do not like that I do it as a faculty member at a Christian university, which delights me, and but also which brings the fire, right? And this is that in-group moderate thing, right? I get it, because the way this works is if they can paint everybody who is against any aspect of their agenda as anti-Christian, anti-Christ. And I make it really hard for them to do that inadvertently, right? I have like one paragraph in Jesus and John Wayne up front where I identify myself as a Christian, and my editor coerced me into putting that paragraph in there, and I was like, I think it's one sentence too many. He's like, no, it's not. We'll take it. Right? I just didn't even want to. It's a work of history, but when you do ask me, I will sound pretty Christian. I am pretty Christian. I attend a Christian Reformed church. My kids go to Grand Rapids Christian School, and from that place, this is what I do.
There we go. Hi, fellow disillusioned youth here. So I have a question that I think relates probably pretty heavily to your book, and it's something that I've found as somebody who struggles with their own faith, that's part of what makes being Christian difficult is hearing contemporary conservative evangelicals and how committed they are to inerrancy, and yet you also hear positions they take in things like prosperity gospel, which it isn't really, there are entire books in the Bible that tell them they're wrong. Job, the Sermon on the Mount, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. So much of what they seem to preach and feel, it contradicts what Christ himself says. And how do you feel they reconcile these cognitive dissonance, for lack of a better term?
Yes, a really good question. And this is, the inerrancy battles too, right? That's a weapon that is wielded, and it was used early on with respect to me, like your views on inerrancy. And I was like, I don't hold to inerrancy. I don't, right? In my tradition, right, a high view of scriptures, but not the evangelical version of inerrancy. I went to Dordt University back when it was Dordt College. My dad's a pastor in the Christian Reformed Church and theology professor. And, the places I come from are very conservative, but not that kind of conservative. And so while I have a high view of the scriptures, it has never fit into those categories in those ways. Which is the case for many, many Christians globally and historically, right? And this is where, as a historian, you can have that broad sweep. And so, yes, they will give certain passages the inerrancy treatment, and others absolutely not. They'll be very, very creative. But with respect to prosperity teachings, you're right. The way I read the scriptures, it undermines that. The way I read the life of Christ, it is about divesting oneself of power, not of claiming power over others. A completely different understanding of what the faith is, and to me, that is not just a side issue. That is the heart of the Christian faith. That is the gospel, and it is wild, and it is very hard to live up to, and I fail every single day. But that is what I hold to, right? And that is what I believe in, and that is So yeah, it does feel like we're approaching a kind of fundamentally different religion here. It's hard not to go there sometimes. But I also, as a historian, I do kind of draw distinctions between, how I approach the scriptures, how I understand, Christianity and power, and clearly that informs Jesus and John Wayne because it gave me eyes to see certain things. But I also don't demand that readers accept that mine is the right version of Christianity. End of the day, you should still be able to learn a whole lot of history and understand things better, even if you think complementarianism is right. Some of my favorite readers are conservative white complementarian pastors who say we need this book, right, to do better as complementarians, right? And so clearly we're going to have some differences. That's what history can do for us, right? So I don't need people to believe exactly as I believe. In fact, the next book that I'm working on, I'm going much more into prosperity, gospel stuff, and positive thinking. And the rebuttal to that is when you say it's not in the Bible, I have come that you may live and live abundantly. Over and over and over again, that is the favorite passage. What does it mean? It is not just spiritual abundance, it is material abundance. And I have to say, now I grew up right? I grew up in conservative, Christian Reformed, like anti-prosperity, anti-evangelical even, right? And so I have to say, as I'm reading their books, as I'm reading their Bible passages and their interpretations, I can say I see where they're coming from. Like, I totally don't agree, and I still think it's twisted, but they have their Bible verses too, right? So it's kind of humbling sometimes, but that's what I just try to do, is like put that on display, and then at the end of the day, it is going to come down to some theological disagreements and maybe kind of incompatible theological approaches, but what I try to do as a historian is at least make those visible so that we can have better conversations and disagreements.
Hi, thanks again for your wonderful talk. I have two related questions. First, when discussing the statistics, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that a high proportion of white evangelicals believe that political violence could be necessary to preserve the well-being of the United States. I'm wondering first if your research allows you to speak to the drivers of that belief at all. And related to that...
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear if my research does what?
Allows you to speak to the drivers of that belief.
The drivers, okay, yeah.
And related to that, you mentioned that the evangelical movement has failed to fully exclude the far more extreme versions of Christian nationalism. I'm wondering how much influence those movements, ones that are more explicitly violent, have in the more mainstream evangelical movement, or are they fairly marginal?
Yeah, no, they're not marginal. So the question of political violence and that number, and this is a PRRI survey, Public Religion Research Institute, and they've been asking it for 2 or 3 years now, so you can kind of see the trends. And it's not getting better. And I think that's helpful to have some of that. I mean, it's a survey question, so do with it what you will, but to me it does track, right? And so I'm often then brought into, as the media is discussing this, because if they've read Jesus and John Wayne, they can see that it tracks. This kind of celebration of militancy and militarism, this ends justify the means mentality, this us versus them, right? That is at the heart of Christian nationalism, this us versus them, a very stark, and then along with that, embattlement. And I write about that in terms of evangelicals' views on preemptive war. If this is a battle of good versus evil, and if the threat is so dire, and it is that they are anti-God and anti-Christian, and right, there's constantly this sense of urgency, and the response then is justified no matter what it is. And then it should be a preemptive response, because why on earth would you wait to get attacked by these vicious enemies when you could get out in front of it? And they'll use examples like, if a rapist is coming in to break into your house and rape your wife, would you let him in the door first, right? This is, I cite that in Jesus and John Wayne. And so the way this works, and this is also kind of, honestly, it's also happens to be textbook fascism, and of setting up, and also genocide studies, right? You can see how this works, of setting up a potential threat, which then becomes an imminent threat, and it is ruthless, and it will destroy you, your family, your faith. Well, if that is the case, why would you hold back? Why would you not get out in front of that? So that's one piece of it. Another piece is spiritual warfare language, right? Very common, and a lot of people use spiritual warfare language in a spiritual sense, and it's biblical, right? But there's not a lot then restraining people who are extremely comfortable with very violent language of a spiritual battle to then apply that when our political situation has been described as the most important spiritual fight of a generation, to be more comfortable, to show higher levels of comfort with violence to achieve those ends. So I think there's a lot going on there. And what has worried me, and in the days after January 6th, I watched evangelical spaces incredibly closely, looking for anyone who was not already an anti-Trumper, someone who wasn't, somebody who was in that 81%, for anyone to call it out. And that's who we need. We need, like, where are you going to draw this line? I'm always looking for please, 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 right? Are you going to draw a line here? And it really worries me, and which I can't say that they won't. And but when you couple that then with election denial, and those really high numbers, I think that's a dangerous combination. Are these guys extreme? So if you look at some of these charismatic movements, particularly, who revel in this spiritual warfare language, they are also the ones who are leading the religious forces at January 6th. Also extremely high levels of election denial there in networks like the New Apostolic Reformation. Are they mainstream? Are they fringe? This was a question all through Jesus and John Wayne, and if you read it, you can see me constantly asking that. Who's mainstream here? Who's fringe? And what happens is there's been a dramatic shift in where the mainstream is. So that some of these figures who 20 years ago, total fringe outliers, now arguably are influencing the heart of evangelicalism as a political movement, and certainly inside kind of the MAGA movement. So that, yeah, that's where I see us right now.
Dr. DuMez, thank you so much for doing this. I am one of the beneficiaries of your book. It's just an experience of reading something that totally describes experiences I've had, especially in the last 10 years of growing up in a fairly moderate Baptist church that now is embracing some very troubling views, going to what I thought was a fairly moderate alma mater that is also on the East Belt line that is now embracing some troubling tendencies. So just thank you. I mean, it was really a prophetic experience reading that book. My question, especially since you threw out the F word, fascism, there a moment ago, a word that I know some probably in this room are also dabbling in its usage in the last few years. And I want to know your perspective as a historian, where sort of your line is for use of that word.
Yeah.
Because in most mixed company, I won't use it. And then with close confidants and friends, it's the only word that we can feel safe as an actual description of what we've been witnessing. So yeah. I'm just wondering where you draw the line on using that word, and when we should actually consider what's been happening as a fascist movement in our lifetime.
Yeah, I'm more comfortable at this point as proto-fascist. I think that's appropriate. I will usually use authoritarian before that, and I will not generally call individuals fascists unless there's a very strong, maybe I could find one here or there. But these tendencies, right? These markers, which I had identified when I wrote the book years ago already, right? I was actually it's too long a story to get into, but when I was finishing up the manuscript, and I went to a political science conference, and went up to prominent political scientists and introduced myself, and he looked at my name tag and he said, "Oh, I know who you are." And I was like, "Oh, great, that's not good." And that was it. That was awkward. And then the next day I went to his talk, and he included in that talk the new survey data that is included in the introduction to my book now, all of those markers of authoritarianism, strong leadership, refusal to compromise, right, all the way down the list. So I went up to him, gathered up my courage after that talk, and I was like, "So is that paper published anywhere?" And he just smirked and ceremoniously handed me his paper copy and said, "This is yours, Kristin." And he knew exactly what I was going to do with it, right? And so I misinterpreted that initial encounter, and I literally got on the airplane to, I don't know, at some event I was going to out in DC, pulled out the little tray table, my laptop, and I wrote it into my introduction right then, and it went into publication, a couple months later. So all which is to say, like, this is real. Whether we use that word fascism or not, there is an open disagreement right now among scholars, not whether it is accurate to place ourselves somewhere on this continuum, but whether it is wise to use that word. And I don't know the answer to that. I do not know the answer. I tend not to not because I don't think it's appropriate, but because I don't think most people actually know what fascism means, except that it's mean to say that about somebody. So I don't find it, in my circles, I don't find it that effective. But when you're talking about threats to democracy, which I believe are absolutely 100% real and urgent, I will use it in that context. I do not think the vast majority of people who are going to be casting their votes are casting a vote for fascism, but that is not how fascism works. And I know that much, right? I know general 20th century history. And that's what worries me, that people that have no intention of bringing about a fascist regime will end up, they are usually democratically elected, right? And so I joked to my husband as I left this morning, and I pulled up my my coat, and I have my little "I voted" sticker on it. I was like, "Oh, this is the second to last sticker I'll have," right? Not really, like, but that's how this works, right? Once you realize that it's too late, and when the people I'm talking with right now, right, what we're looking at is really like 5 or 6 key states and a sliver of voters, one way or another. And then what happens next is where things get interesting, right? Because so much has already eroded in terms of our, if you look at these risk factors, trust in institutions, super, super low right now. This us versus them, demonization of political opponents, very high. This kind of identity politics, right? So many of the risk factors are there. And then you can start looking at the structural issues. And those structural issues are things like voter suppression, right? The gutting of the Voting Rights Act, and then also state level election boards, and this is where you get the election denial coming in, right? All of these things, if you just have this or that, we can deal with it. When you add them all, that is cause for real concern. But we are on this side of whatever is going to come, and this is the moment when it is so much easier to act. That's another lesson from history. This is the moment, and one of my favorite books is On Tyranny by Tim Snyder, right? And if you haven't read it, super good. Some lessons of just like remember these things just in case you need them. And my favorite one from that, and I actually put the book on my bedside table in November 2016, and my favorite is do not obey in advance. Do not obey in advance. And so many people are self-censoring right now. You don't want to offend people, you don't want to lose a job, you don't want to, fill in the blanks. do not obey in advance. This is the time that we have a whole lot of freedom. I didn't know how much support I would get from Calvin. I didn't know if I was going to lose my job. It was a very real possibility as I understood the landscape. And I didn't, right? But some people do. I know people who do lose their, right? So, but you don't, if all of us just self-censor and avoid the fight now, what I can tell you is the consequences are going to be worse down the road if more of us aren't doing things now.
I know there are more questions, but we're going to call it there because we need to have time to let you sit and sign your books. I want to thank Dr. DuMez for coming.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to buy one of those 24 books or have the one you brought signed, you will find her out in Friendship Hall. Thank you. Travel safe.